Most people think miracles arrive with sirens. But sometimes, they arrive with a single bark in the middle of the night. The train carved its way through the Canadian Rockies like a silver blade cutting across snow and silence. Outside the frost-clouded windows, northern Alberta stretched endlessly beneath the moon, dark pine forests buried under fresh powder, frozen lakes glimmering faintly beneath the pale winter sky. It was 2:13 a.m. The overnight train from Edmonton to Vancouver moved steadily through the mountains at nearly 90 kilometers an hour, its steel wheels humming against the rails with the lonely rhythm only night travelers ever truly hear. Most passengers were asleep now. Heads leaned against windows. Blankets curled around tired shoulders. The dining car lights had been dimmed low, bathing the narrow aisle in soft amber shadows that flickered gently each time the train swayed around a bend. Nathan Cole sat alone near the rear carriage, one hand resting loosely on the handle of a worn leather duffel bag at his feet. At 58, Nathan carried the quiet posture of a man who had spent most of his life listening for danger. His broad shoulders had softened with age, but not weakness. Short silver hair framed a face weathered by cold winters, long shifts, and years of saying difficult things in calm voices. A retired police officer from Calgary, he had spent nearly 3 decades working transit patrols and K-9 response units before finally stepping away after the death of his wife 2 winters earlier. Since then, silence had become the loudest thing in his life. Beneath the seat beside him, stretched neatly across the floor with military precision even in sleep, lay Ash. The Doberman's black and rust coat reflected faint glimmers of passing light each time the train crossed another signal post. One ear twitched occasionally. Otherwise, he looked completely still. Resting. Dreaming perhaps. Nathan glanced down at him and allowed himself the smallest breath of comfort. Ash had been his partner for 7 years back on the force. Explosives detection first. Search and rescue later. Retirement had slowed Nathan down, but Ash never truly stopped working. Dogs like him never did. The old conductor shuffled past carrying a thermos of coffee, nodding politely as he disappeared into the next carriage. Somewhere farther ahead, a child laughed softly in their sleep before falling quiet again. Then came the sound. A single bark. Low. Sharp. Controlled. Ash's head snapped upward instantly. Every muscle along his lean body tightened at once. Not panic. Focus. Nathan felt the change before he fully understood it. Years of instinct returned to him like cold air rushing through an open door. Ash never barked without reason. The Doberman rose slowly onto all fours, ears erect, amber eyes fixed toward the darkened corridor leading to the final carriage connection. His breathing remained calm, but something inside him had shifted completely. Nathan leaned forward slightly. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Ash did not look at him. That alone made Nathan's stomach tighten. Outside, snow lashed briefly across the windows as the train passed through a narrow mountain cut. The overhead lights flickered once, then steadied again. Somewhere beyond the walls of the carriage, the wind screamed softly through the frozen valleys. Ash stepped into the aisle. Silent now. Deliberate. His nails clicked lightly against the floor as he moved toward the rear of the train. Nathan stood immediately, grabbing his coat from the seat beside him. The familiar weight of old instinct settled across his chest once more. Not fear. Something older than fear. The feeling that somewhere nearby, someone had stopped being seen. Ash paused beside the narrow door connecting the next carriage. He lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring once against the cold draft leaking through the rubber seals. Then he looked back at Nathan for the first time. The look lasted barely a second. But Nathan understood it perfectly. Someone needed help. The narrow connector between the train cars groaned softly as Nathan stepped through behind Ash, cold air leaking through the rubber seams with every sway of the carriage. Outside, the Rockies rolled past beneath the moon like sleeping giants wrapped in snow. The windows had frosted over almost completely now, turning the world beyond the glass into blurred silver shapes drifting through darkness. Ash moved carefully down the aisle of the rear carriage, silent except for the faint click of his nails against the floor. Passengers slept beneath travel blankets, faces softened by exhaustion and the gentle rocking of the train. A university student with earbuds still dangling from his hood leaned against the window. An elderly couple slept shoulder to shoulder beneath a tartan scarf. Someone farther ahead snored quietly beneath the glow of a reading lamp. Ordinary people carrying ordinary burdens through the middle of a Canadian winter. Nathan watched Ash closely. The Doberman was not searching randomly. His body language had changed into something Nathan remembered all too well from the old days. Focused. Intentional. Controlled tension beneath calm movement. It brought back memories Nathan had spent years trying not to revisit. Cold subway platforms in Calgary at 4 a.m. Long patrols through underground tunnels smelling of diesel and wet concrete. Missing persons cases that stayed with him longer than they should have. Ash had once found a diabetic man unconscious beneath a transit stairwell after every camera and officer missed him for nearly 6 hours. Another time, he had alerted Nathan to a teenage runaway hiding behind electrical panels during a January freeze that could have turned deadly before dawn. The trainers used to call it exceptional instinct. Nathan never fully believed that explanation. Some dogs sense things people stopped noticing. Pain. Fear. Loneliness. Ash slowed beside a seat halfway down the carriage. A man in his 40s sat there alone, awake despite the hour, staring blankly into the darkness outside. He wore a charcoal wool coat dusted with melted snow and held a paper coffee cup between trembling fingers. Ash studied him briefly. Then kept walking. Nathan glanced back once. The man looked exhausted, but not dangerous. Not the reason for the bark. Farther ahead, near the observation window at the end of the car, a young woman sat curled beneath a pale blue jacket, headphones over her ears. Her suitcase rested upright beside her knees, covered in melting snowflakes from one of the earlier station stops. She looked barely older than 25. Ash ignored her too. Nathan's unease deepened. Whatever Ash had sensed was hidden well. The train rattled through a sharp curve, metal wheels shrieking softly against frozen rails. Somewhere overhead, luggage shifted faintly in the compartments. Nathan caught the scent of burnt coffee and old heater vents mixing with the dry winter air. Then Ash stopped completely. The Doberman stood motionless beside the narrow maintenance door near the rear coupling between carriages. His ears lifted higher. His chest expanded slowly as he breathed once against the crack beneath the door. Nathan frowned. The maintenance compartment was usually locked during overnight routes. Storage space mostly. Electrical controls. Emergency supplies. Ash lowered his head and gave the door a single gentle scratch. Not frantic. Deliberate. Nathan stepped closer. At first he heard nothing except the train itself. Steel against steel. Wind slipping along the sides of the cars. Then, faintly beneath it all, came another sound. A weak thud. Barely audible. Like someone shifting against metal. Nathan's pulse tightened instantly. Ash looked back at him again, amber eyes steady beneath the dim carriage lights. Not fear. Urgency. Nathan reached for the door handle and tested it carefully. Locked. The old instincts returned so fast it almost hurt. His shoulders straightened automatically. His breathing slowed. Somewhere deep beneath grief and retirement and long silent years, the police officer inside him woke up again. All right, he murmured softly, pulling his phone from his coat pocket. Let's see what you found this time, partner. The metal handle resisted at first, stiff from cold and years of use. Nathan pulled harder, feeling the train sway beneath his boots as frozen wind whispered through the seams between the cars. Ash remained perfectly still beside him, eyes fixed on the narrow gap beneath the maintenance door. Another faint sound came from inside. Not a voice. More like the slow scrape of fabric against metal. Weak. Unsteady. Nathan pressed his ear near the door for a moment, his pulse quiet but focused now. The old instincts had fully returned. Every sense sharpened the way it used to during overnight patrols downtown when one wrong decision could change everything before sunrise. He stepped back and scanned the empty aisle. Most passengers remained asleep, untouched by whatever fragile thing was unfolding only a few meters away. A pale overhead light flickered softly against the steel walls. The train groaned through another mountain curve, snow hissing against the windows outside. Nathan noticed the emergency latch mounted behind a thin plexiglass panel near the doorframe. He reached for it carefully and pulled the release. A dull click echoed beneath the sound of the rails. The lock disengaged. Ash stood immediately. Nathan opened the maintenance door slowly. Cold air drifted outward carrying the smell of machine oil, damp wool, and something older. Human exhaustion. The compartment was narrow and dimly lit by a weak utility bulb swaying overhead. Shelves lined the walls holding emergency kits, folded blankets, bottled water, and maintenance tools secured with straps. At first Nathan saw nothing unusual. Then Ash stepped forward quietly and stopped beside the far corner. A man lay partially curled against the metal wall beneath a hanging emergency jacket. Elderly. Thin. His gray winter coat was wrinkled and dusted with dried snow near the shoulders. One hand rested weakly against his chest while the other still clung loosely to the strap of a worn canvas satchel. Nathan moved quickly but calmly. "Sir," he said softly, kneeling beside him. "Can you hear me?" The man did not answer. His breathing was shallow and uneven, barely visible beneath the layers of clothing. Nathan removed his gloves and gently touched the man's wrist. Weak pulse. Cold skin. Ash lowered himself silently beside the stranger, body pressed near enough to share warmth without crowding him. The Doberman's amber eyes never left the man's face. Nathan glanced around the compartment. No sign of violence. No indication of theft. Just a lonely old man hidden away between train cars while the world kept moving around him at nearly 90 kilometers an hour through frozen mountains. Nathan spotted a conductor radio mounted near the supply shelf and reached for it immediately. "Car 7 maintenance compartment," he said steadily into the receiver. "I need on-board medical assistance right away. Elderly male passenger. Consciousness unstable. Signs of hypothermia or medical distress." Static crackled briefly before the conductor answered with sudden alarm. "Understood. We are coming now." Nathan removed his heavy wool scarf and folded it beneath the man's head carefully. The stranger stirred faintly at the movement. His eyelids fluttered once but did not fully open. Ash shifted closer, resting his chin gently across his own paws beside the man's shoulder. Nathan noticed then how tightly the stranger still held the old canvas satchel. Fingers stiff with cold refused to release it even now. Something about that small detail settled heavily in Nathan's chest. People only hold on to things that tightly when they are afraid of losing the last piece of their life that still matters. Outside the compartment door, footsteps hurried down the aisle. But for one quiet moment before help arrived, the tiny room held only 4 sounds. The steady hum of the train. The wind outside crossing the Rockies. The shallow breathing of a forgotten man. And the slow calm breath of a Doberman who somehow knew exactly where to find him. The conductor arrived first, breathless beneath his navy wool uniform, followed closely by a young attendant carrying blankets and a compact medical kit. Their faces changed the moment they saw the elderly man slumped against the compartment wall beside Ash. "Dear God," the conductor whispered under his breath, kneeling beside Nathan. His name tag read Martin Levesque. Early 60s. Tired eyes. The kind of railway worker who had spent most of his life watching strangers come and go beneath fluorescent station lights. Nathan shifted slightly to make room while keeping one steady hand near the old man's shoulder. "Pulse is weak, but stable," he said calmly. "He is cold and dehydrated. Might have been in here for hours." Martin looked shaken. "We checked tickets after Jasper," he muttered quietly. "I do not remember seeing him." The words hung heavily in the cramped compartment. Nathan did not blame him. On overnight trains, people disappeared into blankets, headphones, exhaustion. Loneliness made people invisible long before danger ever did. The attendant carefully unfolded a thermal blanket while Nathan loosened the stranger's scarf just enough to help his breathing. Ash never moved away. The Doberman remained beside the man like a silent guardian carved from shadow and patience. Outside, the train thundered deeper into the mountains. Thick snow now drifted against the windows in soft white waves, blurring the distant forests into ghostly shapes beneath the moonlight. Somewhere far ahead, the engine horn echoed through the valleys, long and low like a morning call crossing frozen wilderness. The old man stirred faintly at the sound. His lips moved slightly. Nathan leaned closer. "Sir. Can you hear me?" For a moment nothing happened. Then the stranger's eyes opened halfway. Pale blue. Clouded with confusion and exhaustion. He looked around slowly as though trying to remember where the world had gone. "Easy," Nathan said softly. "You are safe." The man swallowed painfully before speaking in a dry whisper. "Train," Nathan nodded gently. "Yes. You are on the westbound line." The stranger's gaze drifted weakly toward Ash lying nearby. Something softened in his expression then. Not fear. Recognition perhaps. "Good dog," he murmured faintly. Ash's ears twitched once at the sound. Martin reached carefully for the worn canvas satchel still trapped beneath the man's arm. "Sir, let me move this for you." Instantly the stranger tightened his grip with surprising strength. Panic flashed across his tired face. "No," the single word came out cracked and fragile, but filled with desperate urgency. Nathan placed a calming hand lightly against the old man's shoulder. "It is all right. Nobody is taking it." Slowly, the tension eased again. Nathan noticed the satchel more carefully now. Old brown canvas. Weather faded. One zipper partially broken. A stitched patch near the side marked with the outline of Nova Scotia beneath years of wear. Whatever was inside mattered deeply to him. The train attendant opened a bottle of water and handed it carefully to Nathan, who helped the man drink a few small sips. His hands trembled violently from cold and exhaustion. "Do you know your name?" Nathan asked gently. The old man blinked slowly, as though reaching through fog for something almost forgotten. "Walter," he whispered at last. "Walter Harris." Nathan nodded once. "I am Nathan. This is Ash." Walter looked at the Doberman again and managed the faintest ghost of a smile. "Smart eyes," he said weakly. He knew. The words settled quietly over the tiny compartment. Martin lowered his gaze for a moment as though ashamed the dog had noticed what the rest of them missed. Nathan understood the feeling too well. Retirement had taught him something difficult about the world. Most suffering never arrived loudly. It hid itself in train stations, apartment windows, grocery store aisles. Silent places where tired people stopped looking closely at one another. Ash suddenly lifted his head slightly toward Walter's satchel. Nathan noticed the movement immediately. The Doberman sniffed once at the worn bag, then rested his gaze calmly on Nathan again. Not alarmed this time. Something else. Nathan reached carefully toward the partially open zipper and noticed the edge of an old photograph tucked just inside. Nathan carefully slid 2 fingers beneath the edge of the photograph sticking from Walter Harris's satchel. The old man watched him with tired eyes but did not stop him this time. Around them, the maintenance compartment hummed softly with the steady vibration of steel crossing frozen tracks. The conductor had stepped away briefly to contact the next station ahead while the young attendant prepared additional blankets and warm tea nearby. Snow continued striking the train windows in pale bursts, vanishing instantly into darkness beyond the glass. Nathan pulled the photograph free slowly. It was old. Creased heavily at the corners and faded by years of handling. A young woman stood smiling beside a fishing dock somewhere along the Atlantic coast, wind lifting strands of auburn hair across her face. She could not have been older than 30. Beside her stood a little boy bundled in a red winter coat holding a paper kite shaped like a loon. On the back of the photograph, written in shaky blue ink, were a few careful words. "If I get lost again, tell Claire I tried." Nathan stared at the sentence longer than he meant to. Something about the handwriting unsettled him. Not because it was dramatic. Because it sounded resigned. Like someone already preparing to disappear quietly from the world. Walter noticed Nathan reading the message and lowered his eyes toward the floor. Shame moved across his weathered face with heartbreaking softness. "My daughter," he whispered weakly. Nathan looked back at the photograph. "Claire." Walter nodded faintly. "British Columbia." His voice trembled from exhaustion and cold. "Kelowna." Ash remained lying close beside him, head resting calmly across his paws, amber eyes never drifting far from Walter's face. The Doberman seemed to understand that the danger had changed now. This was no longer only about survival. It was about sorrow. Nathan handed the photograph back carefully. "She knows you are coming?" Walter swallowed hard before answering. "I do not know." The compartment fell quiet except for the distant rumble of the train. Nathan had spent enough years interviewing people to recognize pain hidden beneath simple words. There were stories buried inside that old satchel heavier than clothing or medicine. The conductor returned moments later carrying a portable heater unit and another thick blanket from first-class storage. "Medical support will meet us in Kamloops," Martin said quietly. "About 90 minutes ahead if the weather holds." Nathan nodded gratefully. Walter seemed barely awake again now, exhaustion pulling at him like deep water. The attendant handed Nathan a steaming paper cup filled with weak tea. "Maybe this will help warm him," she whispered. Nathan carefully guided the cup toward Walter's trembling hands. Small sips. Walter obeyed slowly. The warmth seemed to bring a little color back into his face. Outside, the train emerged briefly from a tunnel, revealing the moonlit Rockies stretching endlessly beneath fresh snowfall. Entire forests glowed silver beneath the night sky. Frozen rivers wound through valleys like pale ribbons beneath the mountains. Beautiful and lonely all at once. Nathan suddenly remembered another winter train station nearly 20 years earlier. A runaway teenager sitting alone on a bench during -20 weather while commuters walked past pretending not to notice. Nathan had bought him coffee that night and stayed until social services arrived. The boy had cried afterward not because he was cold, but because someone finally stopped long enough to ask his name. Retirement had not erased those memories. If anything, silence had sharpened them. Walter shifted weakly against the blankets. "I used to take this route with my wife," he murmured suddenly. "Long time ago." Nathan listened quietly. "She loved the mountains." His tired eyes drifted toward the frosted window as though searching through years instead of snowfall. "After she died, things started slipping." Nathan understood immediately. Forgotten appointments. Lost directions. Confused mornings. The slow frightening erosion of memory. Walter's fingers tightened weakly around the photograph again. "Claire stopped calling after the arguments," he whispered. "I kept meaning to fix it." Ash lifted his head slightly then and rested his muzzle gently against Walter's knee. The old man froze in surprise before carefully lowering one shaking hand into the Doberman's fur. For the first time since Nathan found him, Walter smiled fully. Small. Fragile. But real. And in that tiny maintenance compartment crossing the frozen heart of Canada before dawn, Nathan suddenly realized something painful. Ash had not only found a man in danger tonight. He had found someone who believed he had already been forgotten. By the time the train crossed into the deeper mountain valleys west of Blue River, the storm had grown heavier. Snow swept across the windows in restless white currents, sometimes so thick the outside world disappeared entirely. The carriage lights dimmed slightly with each gust battering the train, casting long shadows across the narrow maintenance compartment where Nathan remained seated beside Walter Harris. The old man had regained some strength after the tea and blankets, but exhaustion still clung to him like winter frost. Ash stayed pressed quietly against Walter's side, sharing warmth without ever needing instruction. Every so often the Doberman lifted his head to study the old man's breathing before settling again. Nathan noticed it each time. Working dogs never really stopped watching over people they chose to protect. Martin returned carrying a small sandwich wrapped in paper from the dining car. "It is not much," he said apologetically. "Kitchen closed an hour ago." Walter accepted it with trembling hands as though someone had offered him something far greater than food. Nathan could tell immediately. The man had not eaten properly in some time. He took slow careful bites while staring absently at the frosted floor beneath his boots. "How long have you been traveling?" Nathan asked gently after a while. Walter swallowed before answering. 3 days. Nathan frowned slightly. "From Nova Scotia?" Walter nodded faintly. "Buses first. Then trains." Martin looked genuinely stunned. "In this weather?" Walter managed a weak shrug beneath the blankets. "Could not fly anymore." He tapped lightly against the side of his head with one trembling finger. "Sometimes airports confuse me now." The words landed softly but painfully inside the compartment. Nathan looked away briefly toward the tiny frost-covered window. He had seen this kind of quiet decline before with his own father years ago. Forgotten names. Missed exits while driving. Fear disguised as stubbornness. People did not talk enough about how terrifying it felt to slowly lose pieces of your own mind while still remembering exactly who you used to be. Walter unfolded the sandwich wrapper carefully on his lap as though trying to keep his hands busy. "Claire stopped answering my calls last spring," he whispered. "I do not blame her." Nathan remained silent, letting the old man continue at his own pace. Outside, the train horn echoed through another narrow pass, low and mournful against the sleeping mountains. "After my wife died," Walter said quietly, "everything became harder to hold on to." His eyes drifted toward the photograph again. Birthdays. Addresses. Conversations. Ash lifted his head slightly at the sound of Walter's voice and rested one paw gently against the edge of the blanket. Walter smiled sadly. "Some days I wake up and feel normal. Other days," his sentence faded unfinished. Nathan understood anyway. There were pains too large for complete sentences. Martin lowered himself onto a nearby storage crate, suddenly less like a conductor and more like an old friend listening during the final hours of a long shift. "You still came all this way," he said softly. Walter looked down at the photograph in his hands. "A father keeps trying." The compartment fell quiet again. The train rolled steadily westward through the frozen dark, carrying sleeping strangers toward homes, reunions, funerals, jobs, ordinary mornings. But inside this tiny steel room between carriages, time seemed to slow into something gentler. Nathan studied Walter carefully beneath the weak utility light. Thin face. Winter-cracked hands. Eyes carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent too many nights alone with regret. He wondered how many people had passed Walter during those 3 days without noticing the confusion behind his politeness. How many station platforms? How many waiting rooms? How many opportunities for someone simply to stop and ask if he was all right? Ash suddenly stood and moved toward the compartment doorway. His ears lifted sharply toward the corridor outside. Nathan felt the shift instantly. Not alarm this time. Awareness. Footsteps approached slowly through the carriage beyond. Then came a soft voice from outside the half-open door. Female. Hesitant. Excuse me, is the older gentleman in here okay? Nathan turned toward the doorway. Standing there beneath the dim train lights was the young woman from earlier with the pale blue jacket and melting snow still clinging faintly to her boots. She held a small knitted scarf carefully folded in both hands. I think, she said quietly, looking at Walter with gentle concern, he dropped this near my seat hours ago. The young woman stepped carefully into the maintenance compartment, the pale blue scarf trembling slightly in her hands as the train swayed through another curve in the mountains. She looked tired in the way winter travelers often did, cheeks flushed from dry carriage heat and long hours without proper sleep. Snow still melted slowly along the shoulders of her jacket, leaving dark patches that glistened beneath the weak utility light overhead. Ash watched her quietly but remained calm, which told Nathan enough. The Doberman sensed no danger in her. Only kindness. I found this near seat 32, she said softly, kneeling slightly beside Walter. I thought someone might come back for it. Walter stared at the scarf as though looking at something pulled from another lifetime. His hands trembled before he finally reached for it. The knitted fabric was dark green with thin silver stitching along the edges, worn soft by years of use. Walter held it carefully against his chest, and for a moment his tired face crumpled with emotion too deep for words. Margaret made this, he whispered. Nathan exchanged a quiet glance with Martin. Neither man interrupted. Some grief deserved silence more than comfort. The young woman lowered herself onto the edge of a storage crate nearby. My grandmother used to knit scarves exactly like that, she said gently. Walter nodded faintly while running his fingers across. The loose stitching. My wife always worried I would lose things. A weak smile touched his face. Turns out she was right. The compartment filled briefly with soft laughter. Small. Human. Fragile enough to disappear if spoken over too quickly. Outside, the storm had begun easing at last. Through the narrow frosted window beside the door, faint moonlight spilled across snow-covered ridges and endless black forest stretching beneath the Canadian sky. Somewhere far ahead, dawn waited quietly beyond the mountains. Nathan noticed Ash resting closer now beside Walter's boots, the Doberman's breathing slow and steady. The old man absent-mindedly stroked the dog's neck while staring down at the scarf in his lap. What is your name? He asked the young woman after a moment. Emily, she answered softly. Emily Chen. Walter nodded slowly as though committing the name carefully to memory. Thank you, Emily. She smiled gently. You are welcome. Nathan could see something shifting inside the compartment now. The cold fear that had filled the room earlier had faded into something warmer. Not safety exactly. Something closer to dignity returning. Martin checked his watch and exhaled quietly. We should reach Kamloops in about 40 minutes if the tracks stay clear. Walter's expression tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of arriving. Nathan noticed immediately. You are worried, he said gently. Walter stared down at the photograph still resting in his lap. I do not know if Claire will want to see me. Nobody answered right away. The train hummed softly beneath them. Metal against frozen rails. Wind crossing valleys older than memory. Finally Emily spoke in the careful voice of someone choosing honesty over comfort. You still came all this way. Walter looked toward her uncertainly. Emily gave a small shrug beneath her winter jacket. That matters. The old man blinked rapidly for a moment before lowering his eyes again. Nathan suddenly thought about the last argument he ever had with his own wife. Something stupid about missed prescriptions and forgotten groceries during the months her illness worsened. He could not even remember the exact words anymore. Only the regret afterward. Grief had taught him something brutal. People always believed there would be more time to repair things later. Another phone call. Another Christmas. Another apology. But life moved like winter trains through the mountains. Quietly. Relentlessly. One station after another until suddenly there were no more chances left. Walter slowly folded the scarf with trembling hands and placed it carefully back inside the satchel beside the photograph. I kept meaning to call her sooner, he whispered. Ash lifted his head immediately at the change in Walter's voice and rested his muzzle gently against the old man's knee once again. Walter smiled sadly into the Doberman's dark fur. Funny thing, he murmured softly. I think this dog trusted me before I trusted myself. Nathan looked at Ash then, truly looked at him. The old police instincts. The silent warning bark. The way he led him here without hesitation. And somewhere deep inside Nathan's tired heart, a thought settled quietly into place like snow falling across pine branches before dawn. Maybe some souls were never truly lost. Maybe they only needed someone willing to stop long enough to find them. Dawn arrived slowly over the mountains, pale blue light spreading across the snowfields beyond the train windows like watercolor across cold paper. The storm had finally broken apart sometime before sunrise, leaving the Rockies quiet beneath fresh snow and drifting morning mist. Inside the carriage, most passengers were beginning to wake. Soft conversations returned. Coffee carts rattled gently down the aisles. Someone laughed sleepily near the dining car while an old country song played faintly from a pair of forgotten headphones. Ordinary life had resumed. But inside the maintenance compartment near the rear of the train, time still seemed to move differently. Walter Harris sat wrapped in blankets beside the portable heater, looking smaller somehow in the morning light. Exhaustion remained heavy beneath his eyes, but the confusion from earlier had eased slightly. Color had returned to his face. His breathing sounded steadier now. Ash rested quietly at his feet, alert even while appearing calm, one ear twitching each time footsteps passed the corridor outside. Nathan stood near the narrow window watching the mountains roll by beneath the growing daylight. Endless forests blanketed in white. Frozen rivers catching the first silver reflections of morning. He had traveled through these routes many times during his years on the force, but something about the landscape felt different now. Softer perhaps. Or maybe grief simply changed the way a man looked at the world after enough winters alone. Martin stepped into the compartment carrying fresh coffee and glanced toward Nathan with a small nod. Kamloops in 12 minutes, he said quietly. Walter lowered his eyes at once. Nathan noticed the fear return immediately, silent and heavy. The old man gripped the photograph inside his satchel so tightly his knuckles whitened beneath the pale skin. Emily remained nearby too, seated quietly against the wall with her coat wrapped around her knees. Sometime during the night, strangers had become companions simply because none of them could bear leaving another human being alone in pain. It happened sometimes on trains. Temporary families stitched together between stations. Nathan crouched carefully beside Walter. Do you want us to help contact Claire before we arrive? Walter stared toward the floor for several seconds before answering. What if she does not come? His voice carried no anger. Only heartbreak worn smooth by time. Nathan thought carefully before speaking. Then at least she will know you tried. Walter's tired eyes lifted slowly toward him. Outside, the train whistle echoed through the valley ahead, long and low beneath the morning sky. Ash suddenly rose onto all fours. Not alarmed. Attentive. The Doberman moved toward the compartment doorway and stood perfectly still facing the corridor beyond. Nathan had seen that posture before. Recognition. A moment later hurried footsteps approached across the carriage floor. Fast. Uneven. Then a woman appeared at the open doorway, breathless from moving too quickly through the train. Mid-30s perhaps. Auburn hair escaping from beneath a knitted winter hat. Snow clung to the shoulders of her dark coat as though she had rushed onto the platform before the train fully stopped. Her eyes moved wildly across the compartment until they landed on Walter. Everything inside her face broke open at once. "Dad?" The word came out fragile and disbelieving, almost swallowed by emotion. Walter froze completely. The photograph slipped slightly from his trembling hands. "Claire," he whispered. For one terrible second neither of them moved, as though years of silence stood between them like another mountain range. Then Claire crossed the compartment in 2 quick steps and dropped beside him, wrapping both arms around her father so tightly the blankets shifted to the floor. Walter let out a sound Nathan would remember for the rest of his life. Not quite crying. Not relief either. More like the sound a soul makes when it finally stops carrying something alone. Claire held his face between shaking hands. "I have been calling hospitals since Edmonton," she said through tears. "They said you disappeared during a transfer in Winnipeg. I did not know where you were." Walter struggled to speak. "I tried to remember the route." Claire pressed her forehead gently against his. "You came all this way anyway." Ash watched quietly from beside the doorway, amber eyes calm beneath the pale morning light spilling through the train windows. Claire noticed the Doberman then and looked toward Nathan with tears still shining across her cheeks. "Was he the one who found my father?" Nathan glanced toward Ash standing silently beside the corridor. The old police officer felt something warm settle quietly into his chest after years of cold lonely winters. He gave the smallest nod. "No," he said softly. "He just refused to leave him behind." The train eased slowly into Kamloops beneath a sky washed pale gold by the first light of morning. Snow covered the station platforms in a clean untouched layer that glimmered softly beneath the lamps, while distant mountains rose beyond the town like silent guardians watching over the valley. Passengers began gathering their luggage along the aisles, coats rustling, coffee cups steaming in tired hands as the long overnight journey neared its end. But near the rear carriage, inside the small maintenance compartment where strangers had become something closer to family during the night, nobody seemed eager to move too quickly. Claire remained beside her father with one arm wrapped tightly around his shoulders as though afraid he might disappear again if she loosened her grip. Walter looked exhausted, but peaceful now in a way Nathan suspected he had not felt for years. The fear that had shadowed his eyes earlier was gone. In its place rested something quieter. Relief perhaps. Or forgiveness finally beginning to arrive. Ash stood near the open doorway watching the station outside with calm alertness while snowflakes drifted lazily through the cold morning air beyond the train. A pair of paramedics approached across the platform carrying medical bags, their boots crunching softly against packed snow. Martin stepped forward to greet them while Emily helped gather Walter's belongings carefully into the old canvas satchel. Nathan noticed she folded Margaret's green scarf neatly on top of everything else before zipping the bag closed. Little acts of kindness. The kind people rarely remembered years later, yet somehow never truly forgot. Walter slowly pushed himself upright with Claire's help. His legs trembled slightly beneath him, weakened by exhaustion and the long journey west, but Claire stayed close beside him every step. Before leaving the compartment, Walter paused beside Ash. The old man studied the Doberman quietly for several seconds as snowlight reflected softly in the dog's amber eyes. Then Walter lowered one shaking hand and rested it gently against Ash's neck. "You found me before it was too late," he whispered. Ash leaned faintly into the touch without moving otherwise. Calm. Certain. Like a soul entirely uninterested in praise. Nathan felt something tighten quietly in his chest at the sight. For years after retirement, grief had hollowed him out piece by piece. Days had become routines measured only by weather forecasts, grocery lists, and empty rooms. Some mornings he had spoken more words to Ash than to any human being for an entire week. But standing there now beneath the soft winter light spilling through the open carriage door, Nathan suddenly realized something his wife used to tell him long ago. Purpose did not always arrive as something grand. Sometimes it arrived disguised as interruption. A delayed train. A restless dog. A stranger hidden quietly between two rail cars while the rest of the world kept moving past. Claire stepped toward Nathan next, eyes still red from crying but filled now with gratitude too deep for polished words. "I do not know how to thank you," she said softly. Nathan shook his head once and glanced toward Ash. "Thank him." Claire smiled through tears and knelt briefly beside the Doberman. "Thank you, beautiful boy." Ash remained still except for the faint slow wag of his tail against the carriage floor. The paramedics helped Walter carefully onto the platform while fresh snow drifted through the morning air around them. Claire stayed close beside her father beneath the pale blue sky, one hand gripping his arm while the other held the worn canvas satchel against her chest. Before reaching the station exit, Walter turned back one last time toward the train. Toward Nathan. Toward Ash. He raised one trembling hand in quiet farewell. Nathan returned the gesture silently. Then the old man disappeared slowly into the snowfall beside his daughter. The platform grew quieter after that. Emily boarded another carriage farther ahead with a final warm smile before vanishing into the crowd of travelers. Martin tipped his railway cap toward Nathan before returning to work. And soon only Nathan and Ash remained near the rear doorway watching fresh snow settle gently across the tracks. The train horn echoed low through the valley once more, deep and lonely beneath the mountains. Nathan rested one hand against Ash's broad neck and exhaled slowly into the cold Canadian morning. "Good job, partner," he murmured. Ash looked up at him briefly, calm amber eyes reflecting the pale winter dawn. Then the Doberman turned his gaze back toward the snowy platform as though listening to something distant only he could hear. And for the first time in a very long while, Nathan no longer felt entirely alone.